Ryan Stanton here with ACEP Frontline, and today we are traveling back to Colorado for the American College of Emergency Physicians Colorado Chapter 3rd Annual Leadership Symposium. Wonderful, beautiful place, one of those chapters that has great information and great topics to attract you, but also has it at Beaver Creek Resort and Spa, which that doesn't hurt either. We're going to talk today about the future of EM and an update on the match with Dr. W. Gannon Sungar. He has a discussion, apparently at the very beginning of this, he talks about the fact that he invited himself, and with the quality of the talk, I welcome him to invite himself to a lot of different places to chat. So we're going to dive into some of the changing workforce, the finances, and an update on the match. So Dr. W. Gannon Sungar from the Colorado 3rd Annual Emergency Medicine High Risk Do Not Miss Conference.
So why am I up here talking about this? Because last year I was at this conference and I walked up to Anna and Gannon and I said, hey, I could talk about kind of what's going on with emergency medicine education. And she said, yeah, that sounds fine. So I invited myself to this party, which is something my mother told me never to do. And I hope that this is interesting and resonates. You know, I think as we look at the people in this room as kind of leaders and people with influence in emergency medicine, both in Colorado and beyond, I think it's important that we have a glimpse of kind of what the future state of our specialty is. And I think a good lens to that, or one lens to that, is to look at what's happening in medical schools and residency with the people who are coming into our workforce and trying to understand how that is going to impact how emergency medicine changes. What I would say is that the current landscape of emergency medicine residency is likely very different from the experience that almost everyone in this room had when they navigated it themselves. And so I think having an understanding of what that is, and trying to think a little bit about how that may impact the future of our specialty is what the goal of this talk will be. I have no disclosures, financial or otherwise. I will say a couple warnings. I have Excel spreadsheets are my love language, so there's a lot of data coming at you in the next handful of slides. I tried to present it in a couple different ways. I'll try to summarize it so we don't need to really look and stare at the numbers, but that's going to be there for us to understand kind of where these trends are headed. What I will also say is, as Jamie mentioned, I work at Denver Health. I run the residency program at Denver Health. I am affiliated with the School of Medicine and the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Colorado. I will provide some opinions today. I'm speaking personally, not on behalf of any of these organizations. Don't worry, it's not going to get too spicy, but I think there's a lot of question about what the trends are in emergency medicine, and I'll provide my own personal perspective about one way to view these things. So the kind of three main things we're going to talk about as we spend the next 15, 20 minutes is that EM absolutely has become less competitive as a specialty for medical students moving on to residency. The EM applicant pool is therefore changing, and I don't know that we can say for better or for worse, but it is certainly changing, and I think we should understand that. And then emergency medicine as a specialty, and particularly as it relates to emergency medicine education, is adapting and evolving a little bit. And so things are coming down the lane that will change some of the ways that certainly we interact with learners, we administer our residency programs, and I think that will have an effect, again, on the future of our specialty. So in order to tell this story, we're going to go back to Match Day 2023. So March 2023, it was a brilliant time in the world. We were just coming out of the pandemic, and the match in emergency medicine in 2023 was an absolute disaster. Not entirely, but nationally, it was an absolute disaster. And I think there were probably some hints along the way, but it really surprised the leaders and education leaders in emergency medicine in a particularly embarrassing way. So if we go back to that day, 554 spots went unfilled in emergency medicine, almost 20% of the total spots available in emergency medicine, and nearly half of the programs in EM across the nation did not completely fill their spots. If we look at that historically, this is the rate of unfilled spots over the last 6 or 7 years. We can see, and going back even before this data set, the numbers were somewhere between 0 and 15 unfilled spots, so less than 1% of unfilled spots. And then we had a slight bump in the 2022 match with 219 spots unfilled, so 7.5%, and then that match of 2023. And so this was really the point at which we kind of came to the realization that emergency medicine and students' perception of emergency medicine was changing. And the question is, why? So I apologize for this. I was looking last night on the internet for a picture of a seesaw, and this is the only one I could find. It's quite disturbing, and for that I apologize. I actually assume that this is a seesaw that the Dollywall brothers probably played on as a child, which would explain a lot about a lot of things. But the answer to this question, the why, is simply a supply-demand mismatch. And I think the two things are there was an increased supply and a decreased demand. And so we'll walk through kind of some of the explanations for that. When we think about increased supply, one of the components of that is expansion of EM programs. So we have continued to see expansion of EM programs over the last 20 plus years. If you look back historically on kind of the whole time frame of EM, there were about 90 programs added in the first 25 years of data collection once the ACGME recognized EM as a specialty. And then in the last 15 years, we've had about 80 more. So a relative steep climb. Some of that can be adjusted, remember, for the single accreditation. So osteopathic residency programs, which had been present, were rolled into the ACGME through single accreditation, but that only accounts for about half of those additional programs. So emergency medicine across the country, we continue to open new programs. The other component of that is that we continue to add spots to existing programs. So it's not just that we're opening programs, it's that existing programs continue to increase the number of spots they have. And what this means is we've seen a significant rise in the number of total available emergency medicine spots over the last 10 to 15 years in particular. So that gives us our increased supply. And then the next question is the decreased demand. And so if you look at applicant trends in emergency medicine, this is over the last 5 years, and this is the number of unique applicants who applied to an emergency medicine residency. This does not include people who are dual applying to others. This does include people who are dual applying, so this is all comers. And we can see we had this really big spike in 2021, probably as a response to COVID, because everyone was clapping for us at 7 p.m. every night, and that felt good. And so some students probably were drawn into the interesting parts of EM. But then we saw a decline from there, and we've continued to see somewhat of a decline, particularly when you look at specific groups, which we'll get into next. As we try to explore the why for the decreased demand, I think there's a lot of speculation out there. This was essentially the only topic of conversation at the CORD annual meeting in 2023, right after the match. And there was a lot of opinions thrown out. I think many of them have some validity, but if we look at the research, this is the best paper we have. It's not great, but this was a paper that came out where the study group interviewed applicants who had a strong consideration of emergency medicine but chose another specialty. And so it was a qualitative study where they interviewed each of these candidates and tried to pull out specific themes. And these were the 5 themes that came to bear. The major one, and by far the most significant, was concern of future employment. And that was very clearly tied back to the workforce report that came out in 2021. And that was probably the biggest and continues to be the biggest influencer. What we heard from students both in this report and through other data gathering is that deans and advisors were telling them if they went into emergency medicine, they wouldn't have a job when they got out of residency. And they pointed at the workforce report, which we'll talk about in a second, as evidence that that would be true. The next things were conditions. I think our schedule is challenging. We're not going to change the inherent parts of our job that are challenging. But another theme that came up a lot was workplace violence. And I think that is certainly an issue that ACEP has taken head on, and I think an issue that we all care about. But our medical students are spending time in our emergency departments, seeing the behaviors that are accepted that happen in our departments, and they're saying, I don't know that I want to do that for a living, or I don't know that I want to put myself through that. I think that dovetails with burnout. Obviously, we know the national data, burnout is very high in our specialty. Medical students are seeing that, and I think where this came out, not just in burnout, but was career longevity. So maybe I really love emergency medicine and I could do it for 10 years, but can I do it for 20 or 25? Can I be doing this for the rest of my career? Interestingly, another thing that came up was emergency medicine standing in the healthcare landscape, and this came really about respect. And it's not surprising, I think, when you dive into this. I think it's a little surprising to me that our medical students were so aware of this, which is to say that both in the emergency department and on other services, there was kind of always this negative vibe towards the emergency department. And we know this, right? We hand out work in the healthcare landscape, and we all understand that. But the fact that our medical students are seeing the medical system and how it reflects the role of the emergency department, I think is really disappointing and hard to fix. And then I think the last one was exposure to emergency medicine through medical school. You know, if you look nationally, only about 15% of US medical schools require an emergency medicine experience as part of their curriculum. So many have it as an elective, but it's a pretty small percentage who actually require that medical students spend time in the emergency department. And the vast majority of those that do it in the fourth year, where maybe the decision about your specialty has already happened. Thankfully, CU has a required emergency medicine component to their curriculum that is now in the second year with their change to LIC, had historically been in the third year. And I think we see that CU continues to put out a lot of medical students who are interested in emergency medicine, and that is probably one component of that, is that early exposure. I think we can also think about that exposure was probably impacted by COVID. Medical student across the board, their exposure to many aspects of the healthcare system was negatively impacted through COVID, but in emergency departments specifically, some of those required rotations were curtailed or limited, which is maybe we're still experiencing some of that impact. And then I think the other things that came up that were not included in this study but have been talked about a lot on kind of cord listservs and within the residency education community was the impact of APPs in emergency medicine, again, largely as it relates to workforce and employment opportunities, and then the impact of COVID in general and kind of how that changed how emergency departments operate and run. So I think many of us are aware of the workforce report. It's given the kind of central placement of the workforce report in this kind of drive towards decreased demand. I think it's worth talking about a little bit. So just as a reminder, this came out in 2021. It was a study that looked at multiple models of emergency medicine, looking at attrition rates, EM patient demands, the percent of patients who were predicted to be seen by advanced practice providers, and expansion of EM residency programs. So those were the drivers that were contributed in the model, and they laid out about 16 different scenarios. So with each of those 5 elements having 3 or 4 options of how they could play out. And what they determined was the most likely outcome is that by 2030, there would be a surplus of emergency physicians of about 8,000. So about 8,000 too many emergency physicians in the United States to account for the number of patients that needed to be seen or the number of jobs that would be had. Interestingly, the 3 models that the workforce report had for attrition rates in emergency medicine were 2%, 3%, and 4% annually. In 2022, the attrition rate in emergency medicine was 9%. So this was interesting because this came up at CORD, and the president of CORD stood up there and said, the workforce report is wrong because our attrition is way higher than we thought it was, which I don't know that that's like the bumper sticker we're gonna hand out to medical students, is that like, you'll definitely have a job because no one can do this job for a long time. But I think we've seen, and to be fair, that 9% attrition rate has rebounded a little bit. I think that was largely due to, again, the impacts of COVID. But last year it was 6.5%. So still twice what the measurement was.
What data are you using to get that attrition rate? Because we've had all kinds of controversy about the attrition rate.
Yeah, I will say the data is bad, and I would be happy to have better data. This is what I found last night, looking at, I think it was an ACEP follow-up. I don't know, yeah.
The confidence interval on that.
The confidence, and I think,
Larger than I would like it to be.
yeah, I think that's a great point. The confidence interval in the workforce study was also really wide, right? Between those 16 playouts, and I forget the exact number, but there was either a 6,000 emergency physician deficit or like a 12,000 emergency physician surplus. And so what we settled on and what the paper said is the most likely is what the paper said was the most likely. And at the end of the day, I don't have any problem with this study. I think that there's a lot of value in us doing this work to understand how we can possibly predict. I think it was really hard to do this work in 2019, pre-pandemic, and then have it come out with a long-term impact over several years. When we know that fundamentally the job of being an emergency physician was impacted by COVID. So that's what I'll say with the workforce report. I will absolutely say that the data out there is hard to get, it's hard to interpret, but this is what our medical students are looking at, and this is particularly what their advisors, their deans are telling them when they're thinking about emergency medicine is that you point to the abstract and you say, well, you can't get a job in emergency medicine if you go to that. And so this is something we have to be aware of and think about as we're interacting with students, with advisees, and thinking about how we can help people consider a career in emergency medicine. Okay, so that's the backdrop. We'll move on to the 2024 match. The 2024 match was not a disaster. In a lot of ways, emergency medicine as a specialty rebounded, I think, much faster than people thought. It wasn't perfect, and we'll dive into a little bit of how we rebounded, because I think it's important to get into the details a little bit. So if we look at the 2024 match, we can see that there were still some unfilled spots, but from the 2023 match, where there were 554 unfilled spots, 18%, the 2024 match, we only had 135 unfilled spots, so less than 5%. As a corollary, anesthesia had a similar kind of 2023 match in 1990, or 92, I think. And it took them approximately 25 years to recover. And I think a lot of people in 2023 were looking at EM and thinking, gosh, this is going to be a long, long road till we get back with a lot of programs unfilled. I think it's also important to note that the anesthesia, the means by which anesthesia recovered is about 20% of their residency programs shut down. And I think there was a lot of fear in that space too, right? And so I think this was a big win for us as a specialty. I think it showed that maybe 2023 was a little bit of an aberrancy, and it represents a different cohort of people coming to emergency medicine, and we need to understand that. So as we look at match results, so this is people coming into our specialty as interns across the country by kind of designation as a medical student. You can look at US MD graduates, you can look at US DO graduates, and then you can look at international medical graduates. If we go back to 2016, we can see that nearly 80% of the incoming interns into our residency programs were graduates of US MD programs. That number has almost been cut in half when we look at the 2024 match, with a significant increase, nearly tripling of US DO applicants, and near doubling of international medical graduates. So our specialty has recovered, but one of the ways it's recovered is by accessing essentially a new applicant pool that has not traditionally been a significant part of our specialty in our training environments. I think there's a lot of ways to look at this and say, this is good, this is bad. I don't know the answer to this. I'm a DO. I think there's nothing wrong with the fact that our specialty is now having a significant component coming from DO medical schools. But I think we have to recognize that it is a change. And how that change will play out, I think, is yet to be determined. This slide's going to look very different. This is EM applicant trends. And so again, if you look, we can see people applying into our specialty of emergency medicine, that those US graduating MD applicants is declining, our DO component is increasing, and the IMG applicants have increased tremendously. This is probably only relevant to me, but because of the various regulations and various experiences of international medical graduates, their applications can be very challenging to process and to grade. And so this is something that in the residency leadership world, program directors are sitting here scratching our heads. And as you look at, 40% of our applications that we receive, and at Denver Health, we review every single application. But 40% of those are from international medical graduates that may not have standardized letters of evaluation, that may not have dean's letters that are in a format that is kind of what we're used to seeing. And so it takes more time, and it's just hard for us to figure out how to process that data in terms of evaluating those candidates for success within our programs. And I think that is, again, an area where we have a lot of opportunity to grow and figure this out. So the next thing we'll talk a little bit is just EM applicant trends. So this is looking at demographic data of people applying to emergency medicine. And I think what we can see is that our specialty is getting more diverse. So most importantly, we're seeing a significant increase in the number of females entering emergency medicine, which I think is great over the last 5-6 years. And we're also seeing a significant increase in kind of historically underrepresented race and ethnicities. I think it's really important to note that these upward trends, both for women and for underrepresented races, preceded the 2023 match. So I do not think that this is a response. I think we've been doing this work in our specialty, and we're seeing the fruition of those efforts. And I think this is great that this is happening. To pivot a little bit, when we look at EM as a specialty in terms of its relative competitiveness to other specialties, we are now the third least competitive specialty, meaning that this is for USMDs, but if you look at the likelihood of matching into an emergency medicine residency as a US MD graduate, it's at 98.1%. If you look back in I looked at my year in the 2020-12 match, that number was at 89%. So it's never been terrible. We've always kind of been mid-range, but EM as a specialty for medical students is less competitive. I think in a lot of ways this is good, and in a lot of ways, again, we have to think about what this means for quality of applicants. We're going to talk a second about the data for quality of applicants, and I think in a lot of ways it's reassuring. But just anecdotally, at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, the deans are telling low-performance students to apply to emergency medicine because they'll get a spot, right? And so this is a narrative that is out there, and it's true. And so we have to think about how we are going to potentially bring in people who maybe were lower performers in medical school than we're historically used to training, and still train them to the level of expectation we have to go out and be an independent practicing emergency physician and be successful. So we'll talk a little bit about quality of applicants. There's no national data on this. This is only from one program, and it's our program, and it's very subjective. But if you look at how we screen applicants for interviews, we go through their ARIS applications, we provide point values for a number of things, and we come up with a total score. We can also look at step 2 scores. I hate standardized tests. I do not think they are a measure of physician competency, and yet it's a number that we can look at. So if you look at the change in both our paper score, the score we use to screen applicants for interviews, and step 2 scores, over the last 4 years, you can see there's no statistically significant decrease in those numbers. That being said, there is a slight trend towards a lower bottom end. And I think that's what we've seen anecdotally when we've looked at applications, is there is still an incredible pool of EM applicants out there, but the pool's a little deeper, and it's a little deeper in those who maybe were not traditionally considered for our specialty. And so that would be my interpretation of how we're looking at applicants, again, only within one program. I think the other thing we should talk a little bit about is EM as a backup specialty. And I think this was an area with a lot of concern, again, at CORD. When we look at emergency medicine, what we're seeing is that there's been no huge shift in the number of applicants who are applying to emergency medicine and many other specialties. So this data is the number of EM applicants who applied only to EM. And we can see for MD graduates, it's a little over 80%. For DO graduates, it's 75%. And for IMGs, it's at around 30%. But those numbers have not significantly changed over the last 5 years. So this is reassuring for me because, again, as I'm reviewing 1,100 applications, I can be relatively confident that the vast majority of those applicants really want to be emergency physicians and really want to come and train in an emergency medicine residency program. So I think we can be reassured that we are not a backup specialty. We're still finding that the most of our applicants are committed to emergency medicine. So that was a lot of data. That was a lot of slides. That was a little opinion. The only other thing I was going to do with this time is just provide a couple other quick glimpses into things that are changing in the emergency medicine kind of education landscape, and then I would love the opportunity to answer any questions if we have time for that. So 3 big things that are going to be changing in the next 6 to 12 months, So CORD, the Council of Resident Instructors in Emergency Medicine, is recommending that emergency medicine move away from ERIS as an application processing system for next application cycle. And they're recommending that we use Residency CAS, which is a large application platform. OB-GYN as a specialty moved to Residency CAS this current application cycle. I think there's a lot of opportunities with this pivot. We'll see how it plays out. There's no mandate that programs have to do this. It will be opt-in. And yet, I think it will allow us to have a much better handle on the data that's coming into our specialty with applicants, where ERIS has always been somewhat of a black box. I think the way Residency CAS is presenting itself is that the 2023 match, for example, we would have known well ahead of time that applications were down, and we would have been able to expect and prepare for the outcome of that match. So this will be interesting. I think it will impact those 20%, 20 to 25% of applicants who are applying to multiple specialties because they will have to access 2 different application systems. But for all of us who applied through ERIS, if you had an experience like me, it sucked. And to interface with that on my side, it's terrible. And so I think a lot of program directors across the country are excited about this change. Next, ABEM. I'm sure many of you have seen this, but ABEM is changing its format for the oral boards. They're going back to in-person. They're going to be in Raleigh-Durham, and they're going to be at a testing center. And it's not going to be the traditional kind of oral case. There's going to be standardized patient encounters included in that. And I think the goal here is to kind of increase the rigor of becoming board certified in emergency medicine, which I think is great. There will be you won't have to listen to the toilet flushing while doing your. The second thing with ABEM, and this is controversial, but ABEM announced that they'll be publishing first pass initial certifying exam completion rates for all emergency medicine programs, and that will be public. It was initially supposed to be, I think, at the end of this month, and they've delayed it for a couple months so programs can kind of get a handle on it. But this is done in surgery, internal medicine, and I think pediatrics, so there's a precedent for this. But applicants will be able to look at all programs and say, is this program preparing graduates to become board certified in emergency medicine?
Is that both written and oral, or just the written?
Just the written test. Actually, I don't know. I think it's just the written test, but it might be the oral test as well. And it's 5 years, it's 5-year average. And then the ACGME just issued its draft of new sponsoring institution requirements for all residency programs across all specialties. And the EM common program requirements are meant to be published. They were meant to be published in April, but they'll be coming any day now. Last April, they'll be coming any day now. The sponsoring institution changes are really significant. And I don't know that this will much matter for any of us, but in a lot of ways, the ACGME is asking our residents to get much more experience in kind of quality improvement, patient safety, decision-making at a executive level within health systems. And so I think that is interesting, and I think there's probably a lot of good arguments to be made for that. My personal bias, again, is residency is a zero-sum game, and in order to do that, we're going to pull our residents away from the bedside, and I think we have to think about how we're going to adjust as residency directors to make sure that we're still holding a really high clinical standard while meeting all of these new expectations and requirements of the ACGME.
Insert audience question here.
So the question was essentially, is anyone looking at the expansion of EM residency programs as a kind of cheap labor force? And the answer, so very clearly, I'm not speaking for the ACGME, I'm not speaking for ACEP, I'm not speaking for ABEM or any other organization. My personal opinion. The ACGME can't. So the ACGME is a minimum standards organization, which is to say that if you show that you have the things in place for a residency, they will stamp your forms and you get a residency. That is the way the ACGME works. Personally, as I look at some of these changes, including those last, I think ABEM is dipping their toe into providing some feedback to the system of giving data to applicants to understand the variation in quality of programs across the country. I don't know that it'll be successful, but I think that's, I personally, I don't know this for sure, I personally imagine that is one of the drivers for the board's publications.
Has there been like
Another audience question.
There will be. So, I mean, I think that unpacks a lot of things, right? Is like, how do we judge the quality of a graduate? And it's really hard to know. What ABEM has shared most recently at ACEP through a couple meetings with CORD is that there are programs who are graduating residents who are not meeting the level of expectation in the EM milestones to graduate. The scope of that, I don't know. And there are programs with first-time pass rates that are abysmally low. Like 50% was a number, we're all gonna find out in a couple months, but 50% was a number that was thrown out. So if you look at those as markers of quality of graduation, there is some signal out there, or at least stories being told in hallways, that there is a discrepancy there. As soon as that in training exam or the initial certifying exam data comes out, I suspect there will be a paper published within, I don't know, 3 days by someone who is smart that will compare some of this stuff. But none of that data is available. And it's really hard to know how to measure quality of graduates. I think to Ricky's point, like hiring medical directors probably have a better beat on that even than residency program directors in a lot of ways.
Another audience question.
All programs have to adhere to every new update of the EM or common and EM program requirement.
Another audience question.
One of the theories is that their ACGME is going to raise their procedural numbers. And I think there's a chance that that may impact some programs. I don't know that it will specifically target a certain demographic of programs, but I think some smaller programs with maybe not as many opportunities for procedures might have trouble meeting those requirements. But a lot of the signal the ACGME is giving is not in the clinical space. It's a lot in kind of increasing resident exposure and involvement in healthcare systems work. And I think, again, we could argue about whether that's good or bad.
And let's put a bow on it question.
Again, I don't know of any data out there. What I would say anecdotally, last year reviewing all of our, so we require at least one EM SLO to be considered for an interview. And last year reviewing all of our IMGs, only about 15% of them had an EM SLO. And this year that number was probably closer to 60%. And so I think they have access. What I would say is there were about 5 programs where the majority of them, like 1 of 5 programs where the majority of them had that experience. And so I do think that likely that will continue to expand and we'll have a much better, to my kind of whining earlier, we'll have a much better way of how to assess these candidates. Yeah, sorry. It's a standardized letter of evaluation from your sub-I, and it's a great form in the sense that it's not just a narrative that says Jamie Dollywall is great and you should hire him. It has objective measures of performance that allows you to compare applicants across a program and even across the country. Cool, thank y'all.
Dr. W. Gannon Sungar with the future of EM and update on the match from the Colorado 3rd Annual Emergency Medicine High Risk Do Not Miss Conference at the Park Hyatt Beaver Creek Resort and Spa. The Park Hyatt Beaver Creek Resort and Spa. You wouldn't think that would be that hard to say, but there we go. You can contact me, rstant@acep.org, rstant@acep.org, at EverydayMed on X, and also invite you to download and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite player so you're getting every single episode, not only of the Frontline podcast, but also as we expand the network with other content here as well. And until next time, I'm Dr. Ryan Stanton, and this has been some ACEP Frontline.
And in the silence, you will show me who you are.
If you're not on the front lines, you're on the sidelines.
Cue the music.
Bow, bow, bow.
Dinger. Quiet place, all
Yeah.
alone. Da, da, da.